Alright, so here I'm going to give a brief introduction to classes, and we're also going to talk about the separation between a header file, .h file, and your .cpp file. So let's begin by creating a C++ file here. Let's call it class. And in this file, we're going to start by including IOStream, which we'll use for printing out information. We're also going to use the namespace for std so that we don't have to type that out when we're printing things out to the console. So with classes, when you define a class itself, you're really defining the template or the cookie cutter, whatever analogy you want to use. It's a template for creating things. So in this simple tutorial, I'm going to use the example of a user. So in C++, we declare something like this, and I'll go into detail about what all these things are in just a minute. Okay, so this user is right now has 4 properties that are what we call private. And so private essentially means that they're not able to be accessed outside of the class when you're like outside of a class function, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So if I wanted to use this, I could not just say, oh, user.firstname, since it's declared as private. So this is a perfectly fine working user, but of course right now it doesn't do much since we can't create it at all. So let's fix that by creating some a default constructor. So this is a default constructor that takes no arguments. So if I was declaring this this function, we would prefix it with the class name user, and then the constructor name, which is user here. And here I could just set the properties to be some examples. Okay, so here I've just set the first and last name to be John Doe, and so then if I was inside of my main function, I could call this user, and as you probably know, the main function is the primary entry point into any C++ file. So here in main, I could instantiate this user by saying user like this. So I've now called the default constructor, and its type is user as well on the left. So if I want to print something out here like this, and this will print it out. Although actually there's a catch to that, because on line 16 we've declared this this property here to be private. So it won't work because we're in main, we're not inside of a user function. So this here is a user function, so we can just directly call those. So if we wanted to access this for this example, we could simply move this to public. So now let's see how this runs. And as you can see here, the first name is John. All right, so back in our file, let's get rid of this, move this up here. So let's create a constructor that takes some parameters, since a user class is never useful without parameters. So here I would declare the different properties I want. Alright, and there's our prototype for our user constructor. Alright, so in here you may be wondering why I prefix these with underscores. Of course, this is a convention, and you could name them whatever you want. But when you're in this constructor, you're primarily assigning properties, at least in this instance. Okay, so I've set the properties here. The ones on the left here are the properties of the user as declared above, up here. So these are referenced down below there. So in C++, you don't actually need to return the instance of the object. C++ is already going to handle that for you, so that you can just essentially set properties like I've done here. So let's change this here to use the parameters. Okay, so we could do the same thing here, user.firstName, but let's create another function and let's call it name. Just like if you're declaring a prototype outside of a class, you have your return type first, and then your name, and then the parameters. So here, all this function is going to do for us is return the first and last name in a string representation. And this function is simply going to take the first name, add a space to it, and with the last name. Now this of course would fail if the first name is not a string or if the last name is not a string, but for this case we can assume this. So then when we're calling it, this function, you can call it just like so. It already has the context of the current user, and based on these properties, those will get filled in. So let's see if this works together. Alright, and there we go. First name, John Doe. Now, these functions, just like regular C++ functions, don't have to have a return type, and they can be mutable. And actually, I should mention, if it's not mutable, if it's not changing the class itself, it's typical to prefix it by constant. So we really should do that down here. And let's just make sure we don't have a syntax error here. And there we go. Alright, so let's declare one other function, and let's call this clear name. So this one is going to mutate the object. We're just going to set the first name and last name to an empty string. Alright, and then so here we'll keep this statement here and we'll call it again, and actually this should be full name, right? And then up here we will say user clear name, and this should be empty down here. So let's run this and see what happens. Alright, and it does exactly what we expected. Now, one thing to note here, in this example we've been declaring our class inside of our C++ file, but it's typical to not actually do this. So let's move this to a header file to declare so that other classes can use this. Alright, and now let's create a class.h. Okay, so now back in our C++ file, we can simply include class.h, and then if we remove this, we should be able to run the file just the same. And there we go. So, in this quick introduction, I've introduced you to classes and explaining the main function, and then extrapolating our class definition to the header file so that other CPP files could use it. Thanks for listening.